Welcome to Hack Your Hascom. Today, my guest is Dr. Ashok Dasidar, who specializes in chemical process hazards analysis, flammable dusts, liquids and vapors, explosion and combustion hazards analysis and testing, and electrostatic hazards analysis. He is a member of various organizations, including the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, the American Society for Testing and Materials, and the National Fire Protection Association. Recognized as an industry expert, his work has appeared in numerous journals and publications, and he has been a featured presenter at more than 30 conferences. Welcome, Ashok.
Hi, Anthony. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So, in the world of hazard classification and communication, we often encounter flammable and combustible hazards in our workplaces. So I thought it would be great to have you on to delve into these concepts. So let's talk more.
Sure.
How would you define flammability from a scientific standpoint, and how does that differ from the way OSHA and or GHS define it?
Sure. So from a scientific point of view, flammability is very much just considered a very rapid oxidation reaction. And to be specific, we're talking about a fuel oxidizer reaction. Sometimes you could get things like chlorine as your oxidizer, but primarily you are looking at oxygen. So some sort of fuel and oxygen. So we would, in the scientific world, we would say that if you could use an ignition source to ignite a fuel air mixture, it would be considered flammable.
Mhm.
However, in the OSHA GHS space, we're looking at a type of test called the Flashpoint test. And depending on the temperature at which your liquid flashes, for the lack of a better term, you're considered flammable or not. So if you're above a certain threshold, you're not considered flammable anymore.
Okay. And
Wait,
then
wait,
I believe, sorry, go ahead.
and that, there is a limitation there in that, the actual definition that I gave, the scientific one, is that there is no threshold temperature. You can be flammable at higher levels, whereas the OSHA GHS one seems to limit itself at a given temperature.
Right. And in fact, they break it out into categories, right, with boiling points also into the mix.
Right. So, they go from a category 1 to category 4. If you're a category 1, your flash point is less than 23 degrees Celsius, and you have a lower boiling point.
Right.
Your boiling point's below, I think, like 37 or 38 degrees Celsius. Then the category 2 is if your flash point is less than 23 degrees Celsius, but your boiling point is greater than 38 degrees Celsius. And then category 3 is if you have a flash point between 23 degrees Celsius and 26 degrees Celsius. And category 4 is if you have a flash point between 60 degrees Celsius and 93 degrees Celsius. And then if you're above a 93 degrees Celsius, in the OSHA, as well as the GHS ASCOM standard, you're looking at considered non-flammable.
Right. Or combustible.
Or non-combustible.
Yeah.
So oftentimes the 60 degrees Celsius to 93 degrees Celsius is not considered a flammable liquid. You're considered a combustible liquid.
Right. And how would that contrast with how NFPA looks at these?
So NFPA doesn't use a 4-number system. They sort of have, of course, being NFPA, they have more numbers. So they go class 1, and class 1 is broken into A, B, and C. And that's very much similar to how 1, 2, and 3 work with the OSHA GHS. Class 2 happens to be that if you're between 38 degrees Celsius and 36 degrees Celsius, you're considered a combustible liquid. And then if you're between 60 and 93, you're considered a class 3A combustible liquid. And then if you're above 93, so this is the difference here. If you're above 93 degrees Celsius and you have a flash point, you're considered a class 3B combustible liquid. So they don't necessarily give you a definite, well, what is that demarcation endpoint temperature? Because you can keep on increasing your temperature per the apparatus that you're using for testing. There's a multitude. So until you get to the upper temperature limit of that apparatus, if you have a combustion flash point above 93 degrees Celsius, but below, let's say if the apparatus is a maximum of 400 degrees Celsius, if you're somehow below that level, you're still considered a combustible liquid. Now, if you go all the way up to 400 and you have no flash whatsoever, then you're considered non-combustible. However, with, both DOT as well as GHS and OSHA, that 93 is sort of your magic number. If you can get above 93 and have no flash, you're not considered a combustible liquid for the purposes of their regulation.
Got it. Got it. And over the years, many of our listeners are very familiar with what's called the fire triangle. And I believe that's kind of evolved to the fire tetrahedron. Do you know
Yes.
why we have to understand that distinction for hazard
Uh,
analysis?
well, there's a school of thought, and I actually disagree with the school of thought, but the idea is that you need some sort of chain reaction to be occurring in order for that flash to become a sustained event that feeds itself and keeps growing. And then if you can somehow break that chain reaction component, you're actually interfering with that mechanism, and therefore you can no longer have a sustained fire. So in other words, let's say if you have a halon system, or if you have a fire extinguisher, sodium bicarb, monoammonium phosphate, and a BC or an ABC fire extinguisher, or type D fire extinguisher for metal powders, for example, you now are breaking that chain reaction and therefore breaking that fourth leg of that tetrahedron and preventing combustion. I would argue, wanting to retain the fire triangle, saying that what you're doing with those mechanisms, let's say like a halon system or sodium bicarb, monoammonium phosphate, one of these radical capture type chain reaction terminators, is that you're really breaking that fuel oxidizer leg of that fire triangle. So the fire triangle has a fuel and oxidizer and ignition source. The fire tetrahedron has a fuel oxidizer, ignition source, and chain reaction. So just for some people that may just be, not familiar with that concept. So I would say that when you're looking at a chain reaction, that oxidation that's going on between the fuel and the oxidizer is your chain reaction. And that if you were to break that up somehow with a radical capture, you're actually breaking that contact between the fuel and the oxidizer, because you're sort of interacting and interfering with it. But, there's different schools of thought. As, I think they wanted to definitely point out the fact that in the tetrahedron that there's this chemical chain reaction with free radicals that's occurring. And then if you break that up somehow, you don't get to perpetuate the fire. Sort of looking at the difference between a flashpoint and a fire point. Some of the flashpoint tests that are out there are also have a sustained burning component to it as well, where after the flash occurs at a higher temperature, you will get sustained burning. So completely two different values. So let's say your flashpoint occurs at 70 degrees Celsius, but your sustained burning doesn't occur until 100 degrees Celsius. So between 70 and 100, you just have that flash of the vapor. Above 100, the actual pool itself will catch fire and sustain itself.
Does some of that come into play when we're talking like flammable aerosols, perhaps in that category?
That is a completely different beast.
Okay.
So when you're looking at aerosols, so certain materials, for example, let's say if you have, a combustible liquid, its flash point is above 60 degrees Celsius, right? If you spray it into a mist, however, because of the extended surface area, it will become flammable. It will flash very much like, you see movies of people using, hairspray to put out, create a blowtorch that kills a snake or something like that.
Sure.
Thinking about, that old James Bond movie, Live and Let Die. There's a scene where line sort of, uses the hairspray and lights up a cobra. So in that sense, because you're exposing that intimate reaction of fuel, you're not vaporizing, the actual aeration process is creating not a vapor, but tiny, tiny droplets, increasing the surface area. You get a reaction at a much, much lower temperature. That actually has implications when you're talking about not hazard calm per se, but no, let's say it does have implications. You might say that you have a combustible liquid, so you're not let's say if you're doing some hydraulic fluid and it's a combustible liquid, and but you're having this hydraulic fluid in a hydraulic system at incredible amounts of pressure, and you have a hose rupture, and that hose rupture, or just a splice or a slice through the hose, you have this fog or spray that's created because of this pressurized hydraulic fluid. Well, even though it's a combustible liquid, because you had this rupture that's creating an aerosol in your confined space volume where you're at room temperature, 25 degrees Celsius, let's say, you could at that point get a flash. You could have a flash fire that could be injurious to workers or may catch other things on fire, in which case, as a hazard calm professional, what do you say? That, even though this is a combustible liquid with a flash point greater than 60 degrees, if aerosolized, it may form a flash fire. And I think that might be a good tack to take.
Especially if that's a known hazard or in the production process in the workplace, right?
But if it's a known usage, right? So if it's for hydraulic fluid that's going to be pressurized and a pressurized line that could rupture and spray things, I mean, you're not so much concerned about fuel. For example, if you have gasoline and you're, pressurizing it in a fuel line of your car or some other type of generator, and you actually happen to cut the line. Well, you were expecting the flash point of that gasoline to be at a certain level, probably even below 23 degrees Celsius, and therefore you'd expect, a flame. But for example, let's say if you're using, we're in Chicago here in the winter, so maybe the outside temperature is, minus 20 degrees Celsius, and your material flashes at, minus 10 degrees Celsius. You would expect that you wouldn't have a hazard, but because you're spraying it into an aerosol, you could have material that has, like a solvent, has flash fire, even though you're below the flash point.
Got it. Okay, good to know. Yeah, and I think in our world, it's the category of the material you're working with, and then the nature of what you're doing with it. So
Right.
absolutely makes sense. So I know we touched upon a little bit with flammable versus combustible. I know, there's some of the key physical properties that determine this. One is what versus the other.
I think too, NFPA is trying to get away from the idea of a flammable versus combustible. Basically OSHA, GHS, DOT are all looking at that 60-degree delegation. So if you're below 60 degrees Celsius, you're flammable, liquid, you have vapors that are in that flammable range. And then if you're above 60 degree, but less than 93, you're a combustible liquid. NFPA is sort of getting to the idea that, well, you're all combustible liquids. However, you're a class, you're sorry, a class 1A, or you're a 1B, or you're 1C. And it's using that demarcation as opposed to saying, well, you're flammable or you're combustible. So I think people are trying to get away from that because it truly is a spectrum. You have limitations where maybe slight molecular changes, some compositional changes could throw you off. So I don't know where the demarcation came from the 60 degrees or the 23 degrees or the 38 degrees that you might see from time to time in the 93. The funny thing is, though, I think, OSHA's using those numerologies, but the methods that we see to determine these flashpoints are all from a petroleum standard, right? We're using them for HAZCOM, but they were primarily generated for the petroleum industry in terms of quality control. So the Flashpoint standards that we commonly use are an ASTM, I think D02.08. So the point zero 0.08 is the subcommittee, the technical subcommittee, and that subcommittee is about volatility. So volatility of petroleum distillates. So they're really looking at it as a quality control issue, and then they have, well, this is a specific Flashpoint test for this type of material. This is the closed cup, this is an open cup, and so forth. So we are now using this QA designation tool and have stolen it away from that purpose, and they're using it for hazard communication and safety programs. So, and it's sort of adopting somebody else's hammer and trying to use your own and use it to build your own house.
Right. And then tying in that into transport, DOT has those same categories. And then if you spread that out, you know, nationwide or countrywide, country specific transportation. So
Right.
something
Right.
across the board there. Okay. So with that, I think getting into some of the regulatory definitions, you've got, I believe OSHA has a standard definition under 29 CFR 1910-106 that has their own flammable definition. How would that differ from the HAZCOM standard?
So they use something where they're, like your 38 degrees Celsius and lower is flammable, whereas if you're between 38 and 93 degrees Celsius, you're combustible.
Right.
So they slightly have a different one. And again, this probably dates back to situations where, these things evolve with different committees over time.
Sure.
And 37 degrees Celsius is probably something very common in a working environment. And therefore, if you're in a common working environment, how much exposure to risk do your workers have if it's a flammable liquid? Well, if it's 38 degrees and, if you're working outside somewhere in the southern part of the country where it could get to 35 degrees outside, and if you're inside of an enclosure, 38 degrees may not be unheard of. Could you, or in the inside of a car or a trailer, truck that's hauling something along, you could get to that, and therefore is a common type of hazard to be at 38 and below. And therefore that combustible component where it's slightly beyond the normal range of temperatures that you will see, that material that ignites at that level, those are combustible. Those are lower risk, right? So therefore that's probably where OSHA was first demarcating it, but that's in 1910.106. But then in 1910.1200, OSHA realigns its flammability, combustibility definitions to match GHS.
Right.
Right.
To be harmonized. Yeah.
To harmonize it, which is good. I mean, I think with that GHS, you have a global footprint as to how to communicate you're communicating the hazard, absolutely, but also using that to quantify or qualify risk, right? So the severity of consequence, likelihood of occurrence, the sheer fact that you're flammable versus combustible is speaking towards the likelihood of occurrence. The severity of consequence is still going to be about the BTUs that the flammable vapor is going to generate, or the fuel is going to generate. That's the consequence. And maybe the actual scenario, are you on a ship? Big loss if you catch fire to a ship. Are you a transport, like you're back of an 18-wheeler, or are you a tank farm? The consequences are going to be different.
Sure.
But then the probability of occurrence is probably there with the temperature range where the flash occurs at.
Good. And, in our world, we have different agencies. They're kind of, the way I see it is like kingdoms, right? That have their own area. Fiefdoms, exactly,
yeah.
right? So we've got the EPA, the DOT, now NFPA, with their own flashpoint cutoffs, right?
Right.
Why do these agencies use these different thresholds, and what are the implications?
I think part of the reason is that they're looking at protecting different things, or they're tasked with having different roles. So, GHS is about hazard communication, right? And OSHA is looking at that through their HAZCOM requirements, their PSM and HAZCOM regulatory requirements. EPA, however, is looking at protecting the environment from pollution. And therefore, their protection is not so much about, harmonizing with other things or environments, but they have this, hey, we're here to protect the environment. And they might have selected their temperature ranges, decades ago. And now that it's changed with the GHS, they've just decided not to update it.
Sure. Sure.
So that's very, very possible. The DOT, I mean, again, with shipping, if you look at their shipping requirements, you look at the DOT classifications, they sort of match up with the GHS. They use different letters. Like, for example, the category 1 would be like a class 3 group, packing group 1 material.
Right.
And then category 2 would be a packing group 2. Category 3 would be a packing group 3. And then what we'd consider combustible liquid with between 60 and 93, DOT would consider that, just a combustible liquid, not a flammable class 3 liquid.
Right.
And then again, just like GHS and OSHA, they would consider things that are above 93 degrees Celsius as non-combustible, even though they actually might burn at a higher process environment temperature. So you can sort of see where DOT probably started this off, because it's related to the UN Transportation of Dangerous Goods, which is an international type of organization. And then GHS probably adopted it. And then OSHA moved away from 1910.106 and then created 1200, just so that they now speak the same language. And so the oddball outlier is NFPA with their various demarcations. There is a matchup. I mean, they're still using the 23 degrees and the 60 degrees. So it's just that whether does it match up to a category 1 and class 1A? Is it a category 2 class 1B? Is it, so on and so forth. I mean, what does that change? And then it sort of lumps in class 3 and 3A and 3B just 3A has their, category 4. Right. So it sort of lumps in that 1C and class 2 into the category 3.
Right.
And so NFPA sort of breaks that apart.
Now, could you remind our listeners as far as the purpose of what NFPA wanted to achieve? And you've got the 704 hazard ratings. I believe there's some other ones that they kind of are adjacent to what we do in hazard communication, but could be more important. Could you go into that a little bit more about the NFPA?
Sure. Yeah. So NFPA is the National Fire Protection Association, and 704 is definitely the key standard that we use for hazard comm in terms of identifying chemical hazards. What are they? NFPA is an organization that started off in the early 1900s, primarily looking at, developed by insurance companies or founded by insurance, to look at fire sprinkler standards. So they are primarily about occupancy protection in a insurance loss prevention scope. So in other words, NFPA is cited by your building code and your fire code. NFPA does have a life safety code as well for the protection of workers, so long as they're occupying the building, that kind of thing. Right. So they are primarily looking at it as a protection of property and livelihood, but protection of property. Whereas, OSHA originally looked at it as protection of people. So that's where, the OSHA's the 106 flammable liquid coincides with class 1A, 1B, and 1C as a broad category. So they're sort of speaking the same language. And then combustible being, at 38 degrees Celsius and higher for 106 sort of matches with class 2, 3A, 3B, right? So So that lineup occurs. I think what NFPA in effect is trying to do is sort of straddle the boat. So in other words, they had to break into 6 different categories so as to match up with the old 106, as well as match up with the 1200. And that's how they came in. Um, and that's where that granularity goes. I think the higher granularity doesn't hurt them, might lead to some confusion. NFP ultimately is looking for property protection, and maybe there's that level of discrepancy between 38 degrees Celsius and 60 degrees Celsius makes a big difference.
Sure. Especially coming right out of the insurance aspect of things, right?
Right.
That's what you
Right. And sometimes, I mean, with being a member, you sit around these task groups and technical committees. A lot of them are driven by loss history. So somebody somewhere might have come up and said, well, I have problems with, liquids that are between above room temperature, but below 60 degrees Celsius. What am I going to call those? Those behave differently.
right.
What do I do? So,
Makes sense. And, in our world, I think it's especially once we adopted the GHS and our version and the HASCOM 2012 standards, it was another difficulty because up until then, and really it's still there, is that NFPA, the fire triangle or the pictograms that we use, the diamond, the NFPA
right.
diamond, right? And those numbers run counter to each other, right? So you've got that piece. And I know the OSHA does have a letter of interpretation on what to do if you're still using the NFPA. How are you properly training people on what those hazards mean? So I'm glad we're kind of, you see it here right in this discussion on flammability.
Right. There are, I think it's the most important thing is not so much the flammable, is this liquid flammable or is it combustible? What is the actual flashpoint? What is that level in my environment as a worker? What do I need to worry about? If this flashpoint is, I'm in a room, and I'm going to use Celsius because it's easier to talk about. Depending on an international audience, it might be easier. But I'm sitting in a room, 20 degrees Celsius. I have a liquid pool in front of me. I'm using a solvent, spills on the floor. Is this going to be a hazard for me? Should I now get out the spill kit? How am I going to deal with this? Does this have a flashpoint below this room temperature or not? I think that becomes the key thing for an employer or worker, that what becomes this hazard. Now, a lot of that too could be that, what am I doing in my work environment? That's at standard temperature and pressure, right? What happens if I'm using a piece of process equipment and it's at elevated pressure or at elevated or reduced pressure? How does that affect my, again, these flashpoints are more about probability of occurrence. And therefore, if my flash is going to now occur at a different temperature for the same liquid because of the process environment, what does that mean for my probability of occurrence and subsequent risk level?
Sure. Okay. And you get into a really good point here. Is it's important to know how to test and get accurate flashpoint testing data. From your perspective at Faust and Associates, what are the most common tests used to determine flammability and explosivity across dust, liquids, and vapors?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, the flashpoint tests are from the technical committee DO2, which is again about petroleum products and liquid fuels and so forth. I belong to a technical committee called E27, which looks at the hazard potential of chemicals. So the DOT04 subcommittee, remember the DOT08 subcommittee of the D02, I'm throwing a lot of numbers out here, but D02.08 is the subcommittee on volatility, and they set the flashpoint standards at an ASTM E27.04. They set the standards for vapor gas flammability test methods. And one of the tests that they have, or one of the methods that they have in there, is E502. And that goes to discuss which flammability test should you use for your vapors and gases to decide on, the proper environmental conditions. So in other words, when do you use a closed cup flashpoint test? When do you use an open cup flashpoint test? When can you use a small scale tester? When you have to go to a Penske Martin, the Penske Martin tester has stirring in it. So if it's a viscous material or it's a mixture material like that has an emulsion, you might want to look at something with a little bit of stirring. So that offers a lot of guidance. And then additionally, above and beyond the flashpoints for looking at vapors and gases, there's other tests that might replicate, more importantly, what your work environment is. For example, the upper flammable limit and the lower flammable limit. That test looks at the vapor concentration at which your material becomes explosible, and when it stops being explosible because you've run out of oxygen. So in other words, in that fire triangle, that oxygen component isn't large enough anymore to form a triangle. It's actually collapsed on itself. So E681 and E918 are the two tests to look at your UFL and LFL. And then at one point, they used to be called the LEL and the UEL. And that's changed primarily because ASTM has gone with the concept that explosion is occurring when a combustion event is able to compromise an enclosure. And the argument was that, well, we're doing it in a test apparatus, and therefore the enclosure is never compromised, and therefore you never really have a true explosion in that vessel. That's why they moved from the common LEL, UEL nomenclature to UFL LFL and UFL. So ASTM E968 and 918, E681 and E918 are commonly used to get that UFL and LFL level. And then another test method, which I think is better than all the flashpoint methods, is E1232, which is the temperature limits of flammability. And this, unlike the other tests, which are done in a cup type geometry, either with stirring or non stirring, either the cup being closed and you have a small pilot hole where you can introduce the flame to see whether it flashes. E1232 is done in a glass flask. It's spherical. And you pour the liquid in and you heat it up and you let the vapors generate just like you would with a flashpoint test. But now everything is in an enclosed volume and you have heating all around. You have no thermal gradients, and then you ignite the vapor to see whether it will propagate a flame, yes or no. So not sustained combustibility, but whether it would flash or not. And historically, regardless of the material you're using, the temperature limits of flammability test result generates a lower flash temperature than any of the flashpoint tests from the D02.08 committee. This is a huge implication when you're looking at hazard communication and hazards inside of a process environment, whether in a factory or storage location. Because let's say if a flashpoint happens to be 21 degrees Celsius, or let me pick 24 degrees Celsius. So it's not 23 degrees Celsius, it's slightly above that. And therefore you're sort of thinking that maybe I don't have an issue. It's not a flammable liquid. However, if in that, and it's outside of my normal operating temperature. So I have my room controlled. It shouldn't be in that flashpoint range. However, if I were to run E1232 and I end up with a temperature limit of flammability at around 19 degrees Celsius, being lower than that 24, that could be a serious issue. And that could mean that where you assume to be not issue because it's on the safety data sheet as being 24, really could in your process environment be flammable. So in some ways, these values that we're looking at are really artifacts of the methodology that are used.
Okay.
So you sort of have to look at the various test methods and say, what really should I be testing with given my failure scenario that I'm predicting? I'm predicting that I'm going to be pouring a liquid inside of a heated bath stirred tank reactor. Does that really replicate a open cup flashpoint? Yes or no? So if I have an open cup flashpoint result, is that truly the hazard that I'm worried about? And that's what the worker, under HAZCOM should be asking themselves that, hey, I have a flashpoint from a open cup flashpoint tester. Is this really indicative of the headspace of a stirred tank reactor, a heated stirred tank reactor?
Okay. And you brought up a good point earlier. It's very important to know exactly what the end user is actually working with, right? And I'm curious at Fausk, when you're first determining exactly what needs to be tested and how, what methodology you
Sure.
use, how hard is it to elicit the proper answer from your client company, right? When
Oh,
they come to you,
yeah,
and what does that
it's
take?
hard.
Talk us through that process.
And, at Fauske, we're the, probably say one of the largest, hazard testing companies in the country. And, we have these conversations. We have clients that come to us with different levels of understanding and knowledge. So, we have those individuals that were just told by someone at their company that they have to have this value.
Right.
Go out and get it. And they are now contacting us and saying, well, I need to know the flashpoint of this liquid mixture. I know the straight components, what the flashpoints are, but now that it's a mixture, I really need to know this. I want you to run a flashpoint test for me. And then we have to now sort of use ASTM 502, which uses that decision tree sort of to help you out, really sort of, interrogate them about, well, what do you need this flashpoint for? Are you just using it for a HAZCOM document, or are you using it as an actual, OSHA PSM, HAZOP type review where you're going through a facility, you're doing a PHA, you want to see whether a given scenario, you have a spill in a location, is that going to be a problem or not? Let's replicate that scenario, or let's find the ASTM standard test that best replicates what that failure event would be, and let's use that test. And we can do that both with gases, liquids, so in other words, combustible or flammable liquid, as well as solid particles, dust. Dust is a little bit harder in by dust, the particle size and mixture composition adds a whole level of complexity. So just how you have a lot of these test methods for vapors and gases, LFL, UFL, auto ignition temperature, you have the same type of test protocols for dust. But let's say if you're testing this new formulation of liquid that you might have, or refrigerant, you're looking at 132A or a new formulation for a refrigerant. Once you determine that flashpoint or flammability limits, LFL, UFL of that material, it can be the same no matter what. However, if I look at a dust, that particle size distribution, the morphology of the particles could be significantly different enough that my explosibility output or my ease of ignition of the material or my LEL of the material are completely different. So you have that added complexity. And therefore, when we interrogate our clients or ask them questions about what they're going to use the data for, the dust side becomes a much longer conversation than the gas and the vapor side does.
And then how readily available are those dust numbers? I mean, when you get them from the client, could they tell you particle size, or are you able to do that testing for them?
So a lot of times what happens is that they only have this information available from a safety data sheet. And unfortunately what happens is that the report that was used to generate the values to put into that safety data sheet does not accompany the safety documentation. So the original report might have had that particle size distribution and morphology information, but when they're looking at the safety data sheet document, that information doesn't get transferred in there. Primarily because there's no requirement under the GHS to include that information, even though it's pertinent. I think for a lot of people, it's most important to say that, oh, I understand this could be a combustible dust. If it gets down small enough, let me go and ask that question elsewhere, either back to the supplier or an independent consulting firm or lab to see, what is this value going to be?
Okay. So there is a resort, a company or a vendor that can help at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the idea is that, well, maybe the whole truth isn't showing up in that safety data sheet, which is the major vehicle for hazard communication.
Sure.
And whether it's, you end up with sometimes we've seen flashpoints reported, but what apparatus was that flashpoint measured in? What test methodology was used? Was it appropriate? Because sometimes not all labs are created equal. sometimes you might need to use a Penske Martin, but somebody just throws it into you know, a Cleveland Open Cup, and all of a sudden you get a Flashpoint number, but it's not really appropriate for what you're trying to do with it.
Sure. Or indicative of their
Right.
real world, right?
Right.
Use. Yeah. So similarly, are you seeing any um, better developments, innovations for new chemical formulations, or even now when we're starting to look at nanoparticles or materials?
So that's a good question because there are, as people are designing new um, equipment to test flashpoints, there's whole new numbers that are test methodologies that are becoming available. Looking at liquids as small as like 2 mils or 1 mil and being able to get flashpoints. As I mentioned earlier, the ASTM E1232 is a good methodology. Um, what we found with like combustible nanoparticles, they're tested as regular dust is, and even though they happen to be nano, in the combustion behavior in a cloud, they behave very much like micron size, like single digit micron size particles. So even though you might have, let's say like, um, Buckminster fullerenes, you know, you know, 100 nanometer particles, 200 nanometer size particles, when they are suspended in the cloud, they tend to either through adhesion or through electrostatic forces create pseudo particles that are much larger globs or agglomerations of individual particles. So when they go to burn as a cloud, they actually behave more like 1 micron, 2 micron, 3 micron particles. So definitely something that you can characterize. So there might be like a plateauing um, that as you get down finer and finer, you're not exacerbating the the consequence or the hazard potential likelihood of occurrence because you've now reached that level where electrostatic forces and particle adhesion due to surface structure is creating larger pseudoparticles that are on that micron level. The only other thing you need to worry about nanoparticles, not so much with nanocarbon material, but nanometals, is that they can become pyrophoric. So as soon as you take them out of their argon inerting environment and expose them to hair, they could pretty much light up on you. Um, the thing is though that sometimes even micron sized metals, so no, you don't have to get to the nano size where you're at, zero point 0.1 microns or zero point 0.9 microns or whatever. You can even be at that 1, 2, 3 micron level and you can get pyrophoric metal particles as well.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. Well, you know, we have in our world control measures, safety and control for these. Are what are some of the methods used to help prevent ignition when
So
handling flammable?
for a lot of people, again, looks at the process environment. Um, if you're in that vapor liquid space, you have to rely on NFPA 30. So uh, how do you moderate your occupancy or modify your occupancy, other administrative controls or engineer controls to avoid these hazards? NFP 45 is primarily about laboratory features. So you might see a lot of this type of hazardous work being done in a laboratory environment. NFPA 660 is the standard for combustible dust. And again, these occupancy standards gives you guidelines as how to handle these hazardous materials uh, in your work environment. So you go through those standards, see what unit operations you're using, and then you can use the prescriptive requirements in those standards to then incorporate or modify your existing facility or incorporating yourself into a new build. If you're turning a green field or a brown field into a new structure, you could use these values to then modify the occupancy with guidance that's in NFP 30 or NFP 45 or NFP 660.
Good to know. Good to know. And as far as within your consulting experience, do you see a lot of overlooked areas in risk when facilities are storing, handling the category 1 to 3 flammable liquids?
You know what? Over the years, I've been doing this for a number of years. I think people are getting a lot better. Um, Definitely people are aware that those category, 1 to 3, non-combustible, so your primary flammable materials, um, should be stored, better. away from, smoking is also on the decline. So you don't see those odd cigarette butts everywhere and matches. So I think people are getting better. The main thing I want to point out is the hazard that people are overlooking is a lot of times these oily rags or solvent soaked rags could spontaneously combust. You're looking at oxidative reaction occurring. And because these rags are in an insulating environment, the rags are creating a blanket for themselves. They retain the heat that's generated from the oxidation, that slow, gradual oxidation that's always occurring with materials. And that heat then stays blanket aside, increasing the temperature of the environment, accelerating that oxidation, and then again, creating more energy, more heat, accelerating. So you're almost like a runaway train until your pile of rags, becomes a smoldering nest and then a roaring fire. So I think that is one of the major things that I think people are still overlooking. They've been very good about having, okay, I have a solvent solvent receptacle, trash waste. I know I'm going to put that there. I know I'm not going to flush the solvent down the sink or down, the floor drain. I'm going to collect my solvent because it's still known to occur where solvents coming up from floor drain sinks have set up flash fires inside laboratory locations or industrial locations. So I think people are getting better at putting them into tanks. Now, the design of the tank to make sure that the vapors really can't come back into the building, that is an issue that these tanks should be vented to the outside, um, through some sort of thermal oxidizer or some sort of carbon capture thing. Um, I think that would be one of the major things that people are still needing to look at.
Sure. Sure. And I would imagine too, if, companies are required to carry, risk insurance, right? And the companies underwriting those are also going to help, right? Be a resource for some of this, you think?
You'd think a lot of times what happens is you're stuck with the level of training and technical um, competency of the reviewer, and certain insurance companies are treating their individuals or their staff better than others.
Sure.
And so sometimes you'll have insurance companies where the reviewer could come through, totally miss all these flammable liquid, combustible liquid hazards, and underwrite at a lower rate these companies, and they feel fine. I said, well, my insurance company never pointed this out to me, so I must be okay.
Right.
That's when you have an add-on effect, which is what we're kind of lucky with in this country, that we have very active, fire marshals and building inspectors,
Sure.
where they enter buildings and say, hey, time out here. This might have been okay with your insurance company, but I know the fire code and it says you can't store your solvents this way. You're going to have to do something. So we have very good building inspectors and fire marshals coming in. And also, a little less so now due to budget cuts and stuff, but you do have OSHA officials
Sure.
that come and audit facilities, and they know, they're trained well. Federal OSHA is trained differently than state OSHA, and some states train better. Some states don't train as well as federal OSHA. And so you have those inspectors looking out for the worker as well, where, they come in and say, hey, time out here. You actually have a hazardous situation. You need to take care of it. And I'm going to follow up to make sure that you do. Oh,
Thanks for that. And, we talked about this earlier with all the different agencies, defining flammability across the board differently. What advice would you give to EHS managers trying to maintain consistent, hazard communication and compliance across all these systems?
I'm biased. I would start off with the NFPA system. It probably because of 6 categories or 6 gradations give you the broadest range. And you could use those to then push toward the GHS, OSHA level, or the DOT, which is all pretty much one.
Sure.
And you could sort of, I guess also you have that granularity between 106 and then 1200 using the NFPA method. So I think using that and just using a method and sticking to it. Ultimately, the fact that something has a boiling point less than 38 degrees, but a flash point less than 32 versus something that has a 23. or something that has a flash point less than 23, but a boiling point greater than 30, 38, I don't think the worker's going to care.
I
If
see.
it catches fire and they're not wearing fire retardant garments, they're in for a bad day.
Yeah.
So I think that any type of communication that you start off with is good.
Sure.
And then you could then explain the nuance and really have that back and forth. And they may come up with, as you're training them, they may come back with questions specific to that job environment. You can then say, I'm going to address that specifically here because my job environment is slightly unique than the job, facility next door.
Right. And you're continuously, hopefully, auditing your process, finding
Oh,
out the gaps.
absolutely. If you've developed a training module in-house and you're using it for more than 3 years in a row, you're doing a disservice. You really need to update those and say, like, is this really relevant? Am I going to capture some near misses that have occurred at my facility? Am I going to now also incorporate new changes that might have occurred due to, um, incidents that were investigated by the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, for example? Or OSHA documents have pointed out, because OSHA is beautiful that they come up with on their website where citations have been issued.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, you know what? They have a similar situation. I mean, not everyone's going to be similar to yours, but somebody in there, as you're gleaning through these, keeping up with them, hey, that's my situation. Before OSHA shows up on my door, maybe I should do something about it and train my staff.
Sure.
Or, hey, I just got a really good question from the new hire that we got out of school, and she's asking me X, Y, and Z. I never considered it. It's a fresh set of eyes. Maybe I need to address this now, and maybe we need to put it in training.
Right. And looking ahead, I think we have all these emerging energy technologies, the hydrogen, battery fuel cells, biofuels. Those are probably going to reshape what we think about flammable hazards. What should we do about that?
You're right. You're right. They will. The ultimate nature of how flammability, combustibility, and fire triangle is coming together, that's not changing,
Okay.
right? The fire triangle is fundamental. The fire tetrahedron, if you want to go to the chain reaction, but I'm going to stick with the fire triangle. And on the dust side, we have the explosion pentagon. That isn't going to change. What's going to change is what's the likelihood of occurrence? What's the severity of consequence? Hydrogen is going to be different than, let's say, I don't know, graphite. If you're looking at fuel cells or powdered silicon or whatever. I mean, you're going to have a different level of combustibility in terms of how intense that's going to be. Your scale of operation will change the size of the loss. So I think what's going to be combustible is going to be combustible. It's really looking at the nature of the environment to gauge the risk that's going to be different. And that's going to speak to likelihood of occurrence. And so did environments now exist where things we thought were safe are no longer safe anymore? And then severity of consequence. I mean, ultimately a big hydrogen explosion is pretty nasty everywhere. Ask the passengers of the Hindenburg.
Sure.
It's pretty much all the same. So even if we're going to lithium ion batteries or lithium fire, we know what lithium fires do. We've known for years, lithium fires, sodium fires, metal fires. It's just what scenarios are now going to pop up that we've been training for in the past. So these scenarios have existed before. We've designed some form of training to tackle them, whether it's localized Class D fire extinguisher usage, or what the local fire brigade will take care of, to new scenarios where we may not have thought out all the possible failure events that could result in accidental exposure or a flash fire combustion type event.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. Any passing thoughts or takeaways we should have for our listeners today?
I think the thing is not to get too bogged down in the details. I mean, this is not seeing the forest for the trees type of thing. Whether your material is flammable under one decision tree system or is combustible, ultimately you have a hazard there. To look at it in light of your process and communicate that hazard to your personnel.
All right.
And I think that's the main thing. And then use that information also to design better systems so that you don't need administrative controls to protect your people or your equipment from loss.
Be proactive, right?
Be
Sounds like
proactive.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for the discussion, Ashok. It's been great having you on.
I've
For
had a
more,
wonderful time.
thank you for that. And, for more about Ashok, please do visit hackyourhascom.com. You'll find a bigger biography of his excellent achievements over the years, as well as a way to contact him. And we'd love to have you on for a future discussion. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
All right. So stopping recording.